Welcome to Open Door with Dr. Brett, and I'm Dr. Brett, and I'm here with Dr. Megan Cannon, a sports psychologist and performance psychologist in Allentown, PA. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited for us to have an opportunity to talk tonight.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. We can talk to anybody anywhere in the world at this point. What's pretty funny is I thought about before we're connecting here, and I actually know a Megan Cannon who's getting a doctorate in psychology in
What?
in California. Yeah, because I was going through my phone looking for your name, right, to send you a text, and then I'm like, there's two Megan Cannons, but one doesn't have her doctorate yet. How funny is that?
Oh my gosh, and it's spelled the same also?
Yeah, totally spelled the same. Yeah, and she's getting a doctorate in clinical psych. Your doctorate's in clinical, right? And then you
It
moved
is.
into the sports world.
Yes, in my
What?
grad
How'd you?
school.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Yes, in my grad school at Nova Southeastern University, when I was in attendance there, they actually had a
Hmm.
sports psychology program that was housed within their sports medicine clinic.
Right.
And we, as students, were able to apply as an elective
Hmm.
practicum rotation during our
Hmm.
fourth year. So I applied and fortunately got the position. So our responsibilities were concussion baseline testing, and then whenever athletes would have it, not only a concussion at the university or within the area, they would come to us. We collaborated with the DOs, the physical therapists, for all their return to play stuff. But then we were also the clinicians on retainer for the athletes at the university for anything clinical, but then also sport performance. They had those resources accessible. So it was during that rotation that I had the opportunity to really combine the sports background and the more recent psychology, which then was just a great fit for me.
Wow, that's very cool. It's interesting because I was thinking about the concussion protocols and all the things that have changed over the past decade. Like
Hmm.
15 years ago, I was actually in a hot tub with Don Shula, and it was just the two of us. And I was actually able to remember at the time, like I think it was the 72 season or whatever it is, their perfect season, 71 or 72 with the Miami Dolphins. And I asked him that question about, football and what's changing and everything. And he talked about then, I think it was like literally 14 years ago, about the concussion issues and how that was impacting the game and how important it's become. So tell us more about that, your background there. That's really fascinating.
Yeah, so it was actually a really interesting time with all of the concussion evolution.
Hmm.
When I was within that rotation, it had my graduate school was in Florida, and it that year had just become mandatory for athletes at any level of participation that the baseline concussion testing was a thing, and it was a requirement for them to play. And so we really our role within the university, we did a like presentations just on concussion awareness and education to the athletes in the university, in addition to baseline testing them. And then we had the opportunity that when those athletes had concussions, we were with them in the process, having that, their DOs observe and monitor them, while then also us, we would retest them with the impact testing just to check on them cognitively, and then just really collaborate together of, okay, how do we progress this athlete back? What are some of the restrictions? With the academic accommodations, we would write out academic accommodations for them to provide to their teachers or the university. I mean, looking at it now, it was a program that was a bit ahead of its time.
Sounds like it's very ahead of its time.
Yes, the person,
Right.
the primary
Wow.
sports psychologist there, Dr. Stephen Russo, was a part of the impact development at Pitt, and he was working at that university at the time. And so it was very much on the front lines. I honestly couldn't tell you if the clinic still existed today, because I know he's no longer at the university. He's moved back up
Right.
north. But it was a really cool experience and a role, and hitting at a really neat time with the
Mhm.
concussion knowledge and awareness and that evolution really happening in real time.
Wow, that's pretty fascinating. I remember as a kid, because, I work with a lot of athletes as well. And I playfully say that when I was a kid, you just got a concussion and you know what I mean? You got back up and you did whatever you did, because I definitely had a couple. When I look back on it, it's pretty obvious what the symptoms are. But today, now we have this whole protocol, and the sports are so much safer than they were. Um, What's the, in your practice, what's the most challenging parts for you, and what are the easiest parts? So probably a question that very few people ask you. What's actually the easiest part of being a sports psychologist, and what's the hardest part?
I think the easiest part is that I get to talk to these athletes that are honestly just really cool, like all the time.
Totally.
You know, I mean, they're all different ages, they're different sports. I get to learn so much about these sports that I never personally played, and
Yeah.
and so just talking with them is the coolest part of it. Some of the challenges, on one hand, anything that's labeled psychology, there's an automatic stigma. And so there's, kind of working through that, addressing that. I mean, I have some
Mm.
athletes that they have no interest in meeting with me. It's more of a parent push. And so,
Mhm.
in the buy-in from some of the athletes, but then I think more so in that, some of the coaches, and getting the coaches really on board with them attending the sessions that we're doing and actually
Right.
implementing things in between sessions. I think that's something that, from the team
Mm.
perspective, is really challenging, and
Don't
finding
you
the best
think?
way of doing that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Don't you think though that the bias has come down? Because I've noticed in
Yes.
the past 3 or 4 years, like, so many people reach out to me as a sports
Hmm.
psychologist. Whereas if I remember when I was first doing it 10, 12 years ago, there was definitely a lot more stigma. I feel like it's
Hmm.
come way down.
It
Is that,
has. It has come
yeah.
so much down. I think a lot of that we can really attribute to the individuals and those elite levels, like Michael Phelps, Simone Biles, Allison Schmidt, Kevin Love, coming out and being like, "Hey, I dealt with
That's
this.
funny.
This is cool," and so I love that that's happening, because you're right. I mean, there's definitely evolving in a positive direction, for sure.
Megan, you don't know me, yet, and you're getting to know me now. But I went through a pretty crushing, like, health crisis 14 years ago, and I had to start over. And when I started over, I joined a networking group, and it was in Westport, Connecticut. It was the BNI Business Network International, and in that room, I would get up and like do all kinds of, your 30-second little elevator speech, but I made all kinds of clever little commercials that I did just for fun and creativity, because what I'd been through was so devastating that I just started getting a little bit out of the box. Anyway, in that room, finally, maybe like, 3 or 4 months into the experience of joining that BNI, someone came up and said, "Hey, I've been working with Dr. Brett. He's amazing." And then like 4 or 5 other people stood up because they had this sort of stigma thing. This was 14 years ago, but it really has changed
Hmm.
dramatically, right? And for you, I would imagine at this stage, you're probably not dealing with, I would imagine almost none of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely come down a lot. I think where I see it more is, sometimes in like the more athletic administration roles of just, and also
Got
with the
it.
coaches, where some of
Yeah.
it, whether it's a budget thing or whether it's, this is how we've structured, the system that we're in now, whether it's the training or overall department,
Yeah.
it's working. How do we fit this in? Is it really that important? And I think on the to some of that, there's a little bit of resistance, and obviously everything comes down
Yeah.
to money, and
Yeah.
it's taking a
Totally.
resource from one thing to another.
Have you noticed any patterns? Are there certain, without getting you in trouble, are there certain sports where the coaches are a little more open than other sports?
You know, it's so interesting. Sometimes I get surprised because I'm like,
Yeah.
really? I never thought of,
Wow.
all right, but I think that some of the things that we can place even beyond sports, some stereotypes on, there's um some of the more masculine, like I'm thinking automatically being in Pennsylvania, wrestling,
Right.
football, right? Like
Right.
there's a culture there that's a
Right.
little bit less, and
Mhm.
so some of those, I mean, now some of them are very much not like this, and so this is not a blanket statement whatsoever.
Right.
But in some of those cultures versus, like swimming, I've had, a lot of
Right.
coaches that they, because I think in some sports like swimming, it's going to lend
Yeah.
itself to, wow, I literally see you doing these times in practice and totally not in a meet, and so some of that, there's also a difference in, they can see the mental side maybe to a degree a little bit more black and white than some other sports, but there's not so much a trend. I mean, I think there's just a lot of the cultures of the sport, kind of then pour over into who I see coming more often than other sports that I don't see too much of.
Gotcha. Because over the years, I've worked with pretty much almost every sport, from like track athletes to swimmers and rowers. And, because I grew up playing baseball and basketball, I became a golfer. I played a lot of tennis, right? So I've worked with and hockey players. I've worked with a lot of traditional sports. But I've noticed that even like rowers and runners, and it's so much more open now.
Mhm.
What's your favorite sports to work with? Do you have favorites here?
I don't know if it's like, I think the one I'm most comfortable with, so I'll call it the favorite,
You're
is swimming. So
swimming.
because I
You're a
did
swimmer,
swim,
right?
and so just that ability to speak the language fluidly, of just kind
Yeah.
of going in and out of, oh, when you're doing this and that, well, it's kind of like when you're at your January point in training versus October, like, and it's just because I know that and I can speak it so much more fluently than some of, like ice skating. I mean, I'm
Right.
like, teach
Totally.
me what you're talking about because I'm not sure. How does the scoring work? And so for that reason, I think it's fun. But I do enjoy, being in Pennsylvania. I do have a fair amount of wrestlers, and so they're kind of fun because that sport is intense, man. There's two different sports going on all the time. You in the scale, you in the actual competition, and so that's a tricky one.
My twin and I, speaking of wrestling, but I'm 50, I'll be 54 in a couple of months here, right? And back in the day, we were like really, I'm an identical twin, and we were like, super quick and scrappy and small. And so everybody wanted us to wrestle in high school. But back then, there really was a stigma around wrestling. We just couldn't get ourselves to do it. It's changed. That has definitely changed dramatically.
Hmm.
Certain
Oh yeah.
sports, it's like, what I mean, it's just cool to like, be a really good wrestler, period.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's
The
really
mental
interesting.
game though is similar, isn't it? I find it similar with any sport.
Yep, and there's a lot of the common barriers that pop up a lot. I mean, performance anxiety is performance anxiety, whether you're diving in a pool about to hop in the mat or hit a pitch, hit a field, like it's all there. It just, is going to be different ways or different periods of time that it might come out, or really be more or less present for those athletes. But yeah, there's a lot of similarities in.
Have you ever golfed? Because like there's certain sports like basketball or or football where it comes at you much faster, and in golf it's like people say it's like almost entirely between the ears because the ball's not
Mhm.
moving,
Yeah, only
right?
sport. Oh
So
yeah.
right. Have
Yes,
you
that
ever have
is.
you ever golfed?
I have. That is my.
Is
So
that your new passion?
well, I try to do things to emulate some of the experiences my athletes have, just so
Mm.
I keep it fresh, like for myself. And so I've done Spartans, I've done the trifecta of Spartans, I've done Ragnar's, both road and trail, I've done CrossFit competitions. But this summer I'm like, well, what can I do? Golf. And so I'm taking lessons, I'm going out. It is very interesting. Not only, I mean, you can, all of the, oh yeah, golf is, you really need focus and a lot of mindfulness, and just it's really cool from my nerdy side, where I'm like, oh my gosh, all of these things are just playing out, and like I was not focused on that, and I can tell a correlation of, so I have a watch that when my phone goes, it goes. I have to turn it on do not disturb, because even if it just vibrates and I don't even know what it is, like I hit that next shot not that great, and so yeah, golf is a.
That's awesome. And now is that the Whoop? Because one of the athletes I coach, he's on his way to being a pro golfer, and he was telling me about it. So I just like, it reminds me, I got to ask my assistant how I get this thing working because I tried to get it going or whatever. What kind of watch are you wearing? And what
I
do
have a Garmin Forerunner 245,
oh,
that did like
gotcha.
running, the biking. Yeah, there's
Gotcha.
nothing golf specific on it, but
Got it. Now, do you play? Have you found that you play better after you burn yourself out a little bit physically? You're a little more relaxed and more present on the golf course. Are you one of these people that have to work out first?
no, I haven't noticed that yet, because a lot of
Mhm.
times when I'm actually going to play, it's typically after work. And so
Gotcha.
it's just a nice, like, but I have found that I'm like playing nine right now, but towards the end, and this could be a function of doing it after work, I'm not sure, but like those last two holes are really tough to focus.
Right.
And
You
I'm
get
only doing
tired.
nine, and
Yeah.
and so I have noticed that there's
Yeah.
a
But
flip.
psychology, as you know, it's pretty intense. And when you're working with people all day, I don't think most people realize how draining it can be, right? You love it, but at the same time, you are using your energy field, right,
Yeah,
to assist others. What is your
totally.
perspective on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the thing is you're carrying a lot of stuff for other people, like not
Yeah.
putting it on yourself, but you're listening to.
Yeah.
basically just their stress and,
Yeah,
providing
totally.
that validation. And it does take a lot of emotional energy to think about the appropriate response and the wording. I think that's one of the really interesting things about psychology, which you can speak to as well, of just the nuancing of phrases. And you have to be very mindful of how you're saying things. And, and so it does take a lot of just because it's like, you're just sitting. I'm like, oh, you think I'm
Oh,
just
it's
sitting.
like 1,000 times beyond that. Yeah,
Right?
it's
It's like I
really
might be just
totally.
sedentary, but so I have found, on after client days, like I don't. It's so funny, like the quality of like shows or something I watch. I'm like, no drama, no scary
Totally.
stuff. Like, give me something
So,
funny and yeah,
have you ever seen that Denzel Washington movie? It's from the past. It's called Flight. It's a really brilliantly done movie about alcoholism. It's a pilot that's an alcoholic. And people like back when that movie came out, they would be like, have you seen that movie? And I'm like, I don't, like on the weekend, like that's the last thing I'm dealing with the human dilemma all
yeah,
week and it's so intense, right?
yep,
So we don't really want to we
mm,
want to sort of like do something fun. Golf's an amazing game. I mean, if you can get 7 holes after work where you have pretty good focus, you're well on your way. You're practicing what you preach because, that's not easy in the beginning for anybody, even a good athlete in the beginning of learning the game. I mean,
hmm,
the game is so complex in so many fascinating ways. It takes years to get good at golf. You're
hmm,
always learning. You're always sort of realizing, oh wow, you know what I mean? Like we could do it this way. The lies change. I could go on forever, but you know what I mean? The weather changes, the lies change, your mood
yep,
changes, right? Your thought process changes, all of it.
yes.
Are you a meditator, Megan? I imagine you are.
I'm such a big fan of mindfulness, and so
Mhm.
in bringing those practices into daily life, just intentionally, whether it's while running, walking, kind of having minutes in the morning of just okay, like this is where we're at, and so a lot of that throughout the day, absolutely.
Yeah, very cool. Because I like to get up like, 4 or 5 a.m. and meditate before the day, before there's sort of all that background noise. I
Hmm.
find that when the world is quiet, it's really easy to go in deep. I don't know if ever get up early and meditate, but
For me, it's a more of like an evening thing. So like mornings,
gotcha.
like that's I think my natural rhythm is I'm much more productive at night. You know, so in the evening time, that's kind of like my come down, of doing kind of a similar thing and more of a recap on the day. However, I'm trying to get better at doing that in the morning because
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to be said. I don't think I know there's a lot to be said of, what we're consuming in the morning and actually like training our brain in the AM of setting it off on a really positive direction of what am I feeding myself in the morning mentally to then put my day in a direction and start it off in such a way.
Yeah, and that's really well said. I mean, I think there's a lot of truth to that, but there's also truth to like what you're doing before bed, right? If you're watching a violent movie or something, it's going to affect your consciousness, your sleep patterns, right?
Mhm.
It'll mess up your next day a little bit, almost as much as, not getting the meditation in early
Mhm.
in the morning or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And with my athletes too, I'm so big on sleep hygiene. Oh my
Sleep
goodness.
hygiene, that's funny. Sleep
Yeah, because
hygiene.
it's like
Yeah.
dark, cold spaces, like no, just like
Yeah.
retreat to your cave at nighttime. It's you're right, because all those things are just so in talking sport performance or any type of performance, it's those things that we don't necessarily see on the field or on a course that are going to really have a huge impact.
Yeah, I like to say that, we do a lot of work off the field to train on the field.
Mhm.
So often, I playfully, if I get a male athlete, and is an adolescent, I'll playfully say something like, do you have a girlfriend? And if he says yes, then I'm going to his homework immediately in the first session with a total stranger here is going to be, then I really want you to listen to her. And he's like, what? I mean, listen for real, right? Because then we go into
Mhm.
listening skills because that's really training the mind to be more in the present moment and be more patient, right? So there's so much training that we do off the field that affects our on field performance.
Mhm. Absolutely, and there's just the repetition of that, and those different skills of actively listening and being in the moment, it's our brain, we think like and we I think just we make so much sense of it, of physically, of like, well, I can't just go to the gym once, duh. I'm not going to make any gains that way. I have to go consistently and this many times a day or week and like, but then mentally it's just like, no. Where it's like, well, wait a minute, we gotta like do some stuff, and doing those daily practices and so much work out of the sport realm to then be translated into the sport realm for sure.
Yeah, that's really well said. I'm here in Florida, as you know, and one of the things I do often now is I throw myself in the ocean, especially in this COVID experience, right? The travel part of our lives has really been effectively shut down. And so I have that like extra space to throw myself in the ocean. And there's something about nature and the elements and water in particular that I find extraordinary in terms of letting go and getting your resetting and getting back in the moment. You're in, somewhere Eastern PA, Allentown-ish, right?
Yeah.
What do you do? You're like, I know you're a triathlete of sorts here, but what do you do in nature that sort of resets you like that?
So I'm a part of, and I'm unfortunately not able to do this every day because we don't have like the trails every day, but I'm a part of this international running group, and there's local chapters all over the world. And one of the local chapters here does very much trail running. But when I say trail running, like within this running club, there's no set trails. Whomever is setting the trail or laying the trail that day goes ahead. They write certain signs in like chalk and flour, and then we go find it. And so we're in like mountains. And so we're like hitting on and off the Appalachian Trail, but
Wow.
on no way, shape, or form are actually on a trail. And so it's like I'm driving through places and I'm like, oh, I've climbed that mountain before over there. It's like I've been everywhere, but I couldn't tell you where I've been because it's all of this off trail stuff. So even like 3 weeks ago, it was awesome. It was our first run like back. And we were, I would say for a good 50% of the time, like I was having to walk like this, branches everywhere. We have to wear high socks because you're just like cut up. We were in waist deep water, like walking. So it's just those moments of like just getting like out in nature.
And then I imagine when you get back, you're blissed out, right? I would
But
imagine, right?
so fun. It's like
So,
I could spit a rainbow. I'm just like, oh my gosh, that was amazing. That was the best. And so those things, when
so
I lived in California, I'd go to Yosemite, like just those big perspective things are just, for me, that's awesome.
I have a younger brother as well. He's actually a psychologist too, and Yosemite for him is like heaven. Like
Mhm.
that's his bliss. I found but today literally I was in the ocean midday, and I came across like literally I was diving under. I had my goggles on, and I was no more than 20 feet from a 10 to 12-foot shark. And I came up, right? I observed it for a while because I was swimming parallel with it. And I made sure I was close enough to shore just in case the shark turned. And then I came up and there were all these people in the water and the shark was heading for them. So I waved everybody down and I said, I think it's a nurse shark. And like, so you have nothing to worry. So like, and then I realized afterwards, I'm like, it might not have been a nurse shark, but I had everybody relaxed because I told them it was a nurse shark. How funny is that experience I just had
Oh my
today?
gosh,
Talking
that's so
about
funny.
nature and loving the spontaneity of just like,
Mhm.
living, more outdoors. I mean, it's just a great way to live. What do what makes you curious in life? You're a psychologist and a sports psychologist, so I imagine you're sort of curious by nature. Is that true?
Yeah, and always growing up, like until people get to know me, that was always like, oh, Megan's like the quiet one. But really, I just like observe. And
Yeah.
I'm just like watching. And so to me, which I guess maybe the psychology thing is quite appropriate, I'm so curious about people. And like my initial orientation was very behavioral. And so there's always like functions to behaviors. And so that for me is just really, it's so curious about it of like, okay, that person chose to do this. Like, what was behind that? And what an interesting choice, or what an interesting choice of words, and so that I think for me, the curiosity of people.
When did you know you wanted to go into psychology? A lot of people are always curious why people become a psychologist. There are some negative stereotypes, like there's something wrong with you if you go into
You're just
psychology,
trying to
right? All
fix
that,
yourself.
right?
Yeah.
But I often say that, you know, like the difference with psychology people in general is that they actually want to do the work. That's the positive, right? It's like everybody has issues, but psychology people are trying to figure it out, right? That's one of the motivations.
Mhm.
What was your
Yeah.
primary motivation? When did you figure this thing, what, that you wanted to be a psychologist and then a sports psychologist?
Yeah, it was so weird. Not weird, but just like kind of like an organic thing, and it's just a lot of, oh, this is just is what I like. I was in high school, a junior in high school. They had a psychology, elective, and so I took it. And I remember being the only one of my friends that like was into it and that was doing well at it. Like, and now, like I was just like, okay,
Mm,
interesting. And so when
right.
I chose to go to, at the university, I attended at Wilkes University. I went in undecided because I was like, I don't know enough
Right.
about it. I took one class. That's a really big decision, but I went in there intentionally of, I'm going to take the general stuff, but I'm going to take a couple extra psychology classes. And so it just kind of fit. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. But then the moment that you declare it as a major, you're then ultimately signing up for grad school. Like it just is one of those, you have to do that because there's very limited things that you can do with the bachelor's in psychology. And so the sports psychology piece really didn't come until grad school. I had no idea it was a thing. And it
Wow.
wasn't until at grad school in that practicum and learning with that professor, I was like, oh, this is awesome.
That's pretty cool. I went to Emory in Atlanta, and I remember taking this class because I was originally, Emory is like, at least back then, it was like 80, 90% pre-med and then only 10% make it. So you get weeded out pretty quick. And I avoided all the cutthroats by not taking chemistry my freshman year. I took biology, and I made this mistake on the exam where I just like, I pretty much had it aced, and I was filling out the multiple choice answers wrong or something. And it really shifted me to be more open towards this psychology course I took, brain and behavior. It was a psychology course. The professor was amazing. And somehow that course sort of shifted me enough that I was like, oh, I can do this, right? It had a sort of like a combination of science and biology and then like human behavior and understanding. He basically did all these experiments with rats in a cage and everything. And, if you throw basically a new rat in the cage with the male rat, then he'll get his sex drive back up and everything. It was like the professor was hilarious around things like libido. But I was actually a double major of economics and psychology. So I did a couple years first in the business world before I went back and got a doctorate in psychology. So
Mm-hmm.
you're right. If you only do a psych major, you sort of
Mm-hmm.
get, it can be a little bit more limited. But
Totally.
so some of the kids, I often say, if you're not sure, try to double major or minor in
Mm-hmm.
something that you can then sort of put. Plus, I'm also biased towards getting a few years of experience before you go get a doctorate. What did you do? Did you go straight or did you get a little bit of experience?
I went straight because I was like, well,
This is my
for
thing.
me, I would not, I knew, because, you toyed with the idea of the gap year. I just knew for me, I was like, I'm not gonna, I
This is
won't,
it. You found your
I just have
calling.
to do it now. And
Yeah.
then even in applying, when I reflect back on it, because people are like, well, did you get a master's first? And I was like, well, I got a master's in my doctoral program, but like I went right to it.
Yeah, that's
And in
pretty cool.
reflecting back on it, it was, I think a lot of it was a little bit of my personality of just like, well, if I'm going to do this, why am
Yeah,
I
you're
going to
gonna
do something
dive
that then I
in,
would
right?
graduate in 2 years, but then it's not be done yet? That to me doesn't
Right.
make any sense. And so
Right.
there was a
Totally.
lot of ignorance and just like, well, yeah, I'm just going to apply to doctoral programs. Duh, why wouldn't I?
Now,
Which
did you have that experience, Megan, where like, you're 25 years old or 24 or 25, 26 or whatever, you're in some kind of practicum or internship and people are giving you that look like, how the F can you help me? Like,
mhm,
because you look so young, right? What did
yeah, and you
how often did you get that look in grad school?
a
I
lot.
mean,
And well, I worked with kids and families a
oh,
lot,
okay.
like
So that
of, and
helps.
then that
That
helped.
does
And then
help.
the athletes
Yeah.
were in college. And so
Right.
that was helpful. But when I was licensed and, was starting to work in sports, I would get a lot of comments, a lot from coaches of
Right.
just like, you're so young. You're so
Yeah,
young.
totally.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, yes.
Yeah.
I don't, mhm. But
Yeah.
definitely a lot of comments about that.
Very cool. Yeah, it's a little tricky when you look, when you're young and then you even look younger than you are, right? And now you've got parents or coaches or teachers that are looking at you going, how can this freaking kid help me, right?
Mhm.
But like grad school and psychology is pretty demanding, right? There's a lot of learning there.
Yeah.
What was your experience like?
It was a lot. It was,
It's a lot. It
it
really
is a
is.
lot.
Yeah.
I was so fortunate that within my program, I have made the absolute best friends, that even today are what I would consider like my closest friends or some of my closest friends. And so it was this very almost like a trauma bond, where it was so
I mean,
stressful,
just
and we
how
were
intense.
so, because I mean, there are certain things where it's like, well, you don't pass this, sorry, like you're
Yeah.
behind an entire year, or you like,
Yeah.
and and you couldn't get more than, you had to get A's and B's. You were not allowed to get C's. If you got two C's, you were kicked out. And so it was like, there was very small margins for error, and everybody was at, like the same level. And so it was a lot of work, a lot of just those like projects that were the gatekeeping projects of, you have to do this, otherwise you can't go on, or you're going to be behind an entire year, and like that, just it is the way it is. And so it was very stressful, a lot of
Yeah,
work.
totally. People don't realize, because I did grad school in San Diego and they would ask me if I surfed. And, at the time I was like, trying to golf once a week, playing tennis, body surfing, running, what I mean? Like literally every sport you could think of that I could squeeze in on 80 hours a week or more of graduate school, right? I mean, people
Yeah.
don't realize that like it's very, very intense, right? Because first you have your, just 1 year, you had that first year of just coursework, right? And we would all, like all of us, we all bonded and we would get pretty much drunk every Friday night at this bar in Pacific Beach called Hennessy's. And then that was it. It was after that first year, now you have, right? Now you have internships and classes. And then by your third
Mhm.
year, you've got your dissertation internship and classes. Then
Oh
you have
yeah.
comprehensive exams along the
Oh
way. And for us anyway, as far as I could recall, we were allowed one B minus, two B minuses, and you're no good.
yeah.
So there's no such thing as a C, right? It wasn't. And I remember Megan like taking a whole week off and writing for one class, for one professor in graduate school. We had to write 5 10-page papers. So it took me a whole week of my life just to pass her one class, five ten
Mhm.
page can think about 5 10-page papers for one class, right? On top of everything else. So yeah,
Yeah.
I'm proud of you for sticking with it, right? It's pretty intense.
Yeah,
How'd
it's
you
intense.
choose your postdoc? Where'd you do your postdoc and how'd you choose it?
So my postdoc was at Pacific Clinics in Pasadena, California. So it was a community
Mm,
mental health agency. And I was just really fortunate enough. I had, at the time there was one sports psychology internship, pre-doc internship, and that was at UC Davis. Outside of that, there were minors where I would contact the program, and it was at counseling centers, and it was like, oh well, if we get an athlete, you would get them, or and so there was not really like structured programs. And so at internship, that's talk about a major gatekeeper, right? You just need to get one, otherwise you're never going to graduate.
yeah,
And
you need
so
your license,
yeah,
exactly.
and so I
Yeah.
did, I applied to some of the sports psych one, but then, was very motivated of like, all right, Southern California, that's not gonna stink for a couple years. And
Well,
so
especially Pasadena. I mean, that is so beautiful there. I
oh,
lived
it's
in
so
LA
pretty.
for 3 years, so
Yeah,
it's
so
gorgeous
it was
there.
awesome. Yeah, so I lived in East LA and had a reverse commute to Pasadena, wound up just
Yeah.
with this program for pre-doc internship and postdoc, and it was a great experience. And then like I like basically within November of internship, so like right when it started, you already have to look for what's next. And so I had been in contact with a sports psychologist in the Pennsylvania area of, all right, the moment that this like degree is in hand, we're doing this. We're coming back and we're gonna like re-immerse in the sport world again, because that's just where I wanted to be.
It's really awesome that you had such clarity. It took me a long road. I did a good decade of clinical psych, families, adolescents. I mean, it's an amazing background to work with athletes because a lot of times I wind up working with the whole system, not just the coaches, but the family members. And having done, thousands of sessions with families, there's a huge advantage there, right? To understand all those cross currents and be able to navigate them.
Mhm.
Do you do any of that family work? If an athlete is struggling, with relationships with, parents or
Yeah.
siblings or whatever it is?
Yeah, when it's appropriate, and it's, when that's the we need to like really address that, because there's, you can only do so much with that athlete if then they're just returning to a system that
Right.
is reinforcing some of these things that are not helpful. And so Yeah, and that's where I think that the clinical plus this performance piece is really helpful because,
Yeah.
as you know, and I'm sure I can speak to, there's such an overlap of the family
Massive overlap.
system, the mental and emotional health piece, and the sport performance that like trying to piece them apart without that integration of it inevitably comes back together. Um, that's really tough. I don't.
Yeah, I think I mean, that's beautifully said. I mean, it's a really good summary. I feel like I would communicate something very similar, right? It's like all these different moving parts are, necessary. I mean, when an athlete, as you know, when their personal life is really humming, it makes just a world of difference, right? When they don't have to worry about all these different cross currents that
Mhm.
so often in life are difficult, especially even money, right? How do you deal with money issues? Like what's your take on the money thing?
Oh my goodness. Speaking of the systems, it's just so, oh my goodness. Sometimes I just hear things that, in thinking of situations in particular of, in like the gymnastics or very like that competitive cheerleading world where there's certain levels
Oh,
of
totally.
skills,
Totally.
right? And I've literally had athletes, where the parents are like, well, they won't do their back skills and da 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 da. Da. But then I talk to the athlete and I hear, oh, well, mom and dad says if I don't do this back stuff, they're going to stop paying for me to come here and do. And it's just like, how do you not see you're adding to this, stress? And so something that I very much, when I speak with parents and whether I do like a parent presentation for different teams or it's just in an individual meeting, I really communicate 2 points very clearly. One, why did you choose to get your kid into this? And I will ask them, and challenge them to identify that. And same answers, right? Like character development, tolerating failure,
Mm.
time management, all these things. And it's like, right, so never to be the kid next door. Glad that we've been aware of that. But then I also, communicate the point of you chose this, right? I mean, when your kid was 3, I'm sure they really, like there was a choice there. And part of getting your kid involved in getting these benefits, there is a financial sacrifice for what sports has the opportunity to provide for them. These pressure cooker situations, we can see skill deficits, we can enable them in a safe way, not when they're 35 in the midst of their career. Like with baseball, when you're 15, we can find some of these skill deficits, teach these different things. And it's challenging the parents to go back to that and reminding them of this was a choice, that you had made. Level of involvement to a degree was also your choice too. We can't throw that back in the athlete's face. It's just, because I've heard that happen so often. And I can see how as a parent, it's you can lose that perspective really easily when you're waking up so early on weekends and things. You have to pay for so much stuff, and and so really just challenging the parents to reflect on, well, what is it that you're really trying to have your athlete get out of this with this choice of a financial decision. Like, do you feel it's still paying off? Like, do you have to do it to a certain, but whatever degree you're doing it, and just having those conversations, because for that to then be put on a kid is then ultimately a huge stress and just period wrong.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. I mean, I've seen so many kids where they feel guilty. They feel like, oh, my parents are paying for this. And part of the challenge, as you know, is that the parents are reminding the kid
Mm,
8,000 times how much they're paying. And so the more they remind the kid, the more they're hammering the kid, which
yeah,
ultimately, as you know, ends up in some kind of guilt dynamic, right? Or pressure dynamic, right? Where they
totally.
feel like they have to now perform at the highest level because otherwise they're wasting their parents' money.
Hmm.
And that's just more stress and pressure. And when we're working with performance issues, we want to take down as much of that external stress and just allow them to like perform, right? To compete
Hmm.
at their, whatever they're really, why they love it in the first place, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, totally. What are you curious about while you have me here? What are you curious about? Anything you want to ask me?
And so with you, what have been some of like the sports that you have found? Because it sounds like you've worked with a number of like a lot of different sports for you.
Oh,
Are
yeah,
there certain
totally.
sports that you have found to be the most challenging, or what are some of like the more common things that you come up against?
Oh, I like it. I like it when people ask me questions. But no, I mean, like I have a lot of self confidence, so I really feel like the fundamentals of the mental game really do work for pretty much every sport on the planet. The meditation, the mindfulness, visualization, breath work, self-talk, the communication skills, and then, all these moving parts of someone's life and really getting them sort of in alignment. So I don't really have a lack of confidence when it comes. I've worked with like Olympic, runners, and I've worked with all kinds of hockey players and sports that, we grew up playing baseball and basketball, and, I became really decent at golf, and we were tennis players as young kids. So I understand those sports kind of like you understand swimming or softball, because I know you played some softball as well. So I understand those sports, like the language better. But like you, I love to learn the language of something. I'm always curious too. So I like the language of the different sports. When I'm working with a swimmer, I've worked with several swimmers, on and off over the years. It's not my sport. It's not my thing, right? But that anxiety that people experience before they get out of the gate, right? That's common for all of us, right? That, butterflies is one thing, but too much anxiety messes your start. And then if you can't get off to a good start, you're at a huge disadvantage, especially if it's like, 200 yards or, whatever it is, something a shorter event. So for me, I don't worry about the sport per se, because I know I'll catch up with the language as we go. It's more just, do we have the chemistry? Are we going to connect? I tell parents all the time, if your son or daughter if we like each other, it's going to be a home run for you guys. Because I know I'm going to, if I get behind somebody, they're going to win. Because I just don't operate like, for me, taking on a life is very profound, right? It's like taking on an athlete is like, there's so many levels and layers to it, right? I'm answering texts all week long in a grateful way, because I like the I like the interactivity, and I will take a call at 10 o'clock at night if it, if we need if it's necessary. So my commitment to, excellence, it sounds like we're very similar that way. It's just you have this super high, which is part of the reason why I love athletes so much, is you tend to have a higher commitment to excellence, when you work with athletes, as opposed to what I call playfully the proletariat at large, right? So have you found that? Have you found that similar?
No, it's the NARPs, the non-athletic regular people. Yeah, no, and that's part of the reason
I've
why
never heard that term, the NARPs, the non-athletic regular people, whatever. I do have this nerdy, like, data scientist dude that I've helped so much. It's crazy. And I've learned his language, data science. It's like, holy cow. I mean, I work so hard when he starts getting technical on me, right? Like, to just try to hang in there. By the way, my wife is Thai, and when I'm shot at night, I try to practice what I preach. So I listen to her. And when you're exhausted, her English normally is probably 75 or 85%. But when you're exhausted, it feels like 45%. And so you got to work like 30 times harder. But it's so important, right? To work on your listening skills, right? To be present and to really pay attention, and, it's a big form of love. I mean, really, like, right? And sharing.
Right. And that's where, in meeting with, whether it's a sports psychologist, for an athlete, or even just psychology in general, is that opportunity to be heard, right? And to be seen. And that, is outside of the work of whether it's sports specific things, it's really at the base of it, of just like being heard and getting listened to, and getting that opportunity of just talk about yourself, like, do it. You don't ever have to ask me how I'm doing. That's not what we're doing here. Like, you can, but this is all about you. And I think we're so busy that people don't get that often.
Yeah, no, and people really do. I often say that that's at least half of it, is the ability, when you're listening, and, that a lot of people don't feel heard or understood and don't feel listened to. But on the other end of the experience, I often challenge people to take interactive roles and to actually ask about me intentionally, because what I also find is that a lot of people are too caught up in self, too self-consumed. And so their relationships are reflecting that, even with coaches, right? Even with, other athletes. I'm teaching a lot of the kids to actually get more, you and I are curious by nature, but not everybody is. And when you're naturally curious, you're actually not just learning more, but you're showing a genuine interest in other, and it really does enhance your interpersonal ability as you're aware, which then affects your whole, your whole life, as well as your ability to perform.
Yeah, that's a really great point.
Yeah, totally. What else for today, Megan? What else is important? Is there anything that you're working on? Are you working on a bestseller, or is there something we can, like, that you want to share before we wrap up?
Yeah, so I'm actually working, and this was like pre-corona, it was in the works. I've just had a little bit more time to work on it now, which is an online training program because I
Fantastic.
teach on performance anxiety. I would say 85% of the athletes I talk with,
Totally.
that anxiety is there. And so my goal was, how can I, if I'm meeting with an athlete one-on-one, that's amazing, and I'm able to get this knowledge to them and like teach these emotional regulation skills. That's one person. How is there a way I can, expand on that, just to have a curriculum and content accessible to athletes if they're interested, and just as a resource to them. So I have like it's a 10-step or a 10 session, 10 module online training format with some bonus materials. There's a parent module as well that runs through all of the parent stuff and handouts, and just different things, the way they can support their athletes going through it. And so that's been the big heavy project of quarantine, I guess, so far, is really getting a bulk of that done. And so it'll be launched up here by the end of the year, which is really, I'm excited for
Fantastic.
it.
That's really cool. So it sounds like you found a way to be like focused and creative in this quarantine process, right? So you're
Absolutely.
100% practicing what you preach. You're really, there's a wonderful authenticity to you. It's really nice to have this experience with you. Dr. Megan Cannon, and I'm Dr. Brett, and thank you so much for watching.